This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. On today's show, our 100th, progressive icon Fred Harris talks about challenges facing the second Obama administration, including barriers to organized labor. Law professor Larry Gibson tells us about his new biography of a young Thurgood Marshall. And historian Steve Conn rips Republicans for hating government, except for when they need it. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Fred Harris was a U.S. Senator from Oklahoma, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and a candidate for president. Still active, Fred tells us what he sees as challenges for the second Obama administration: labor rights, the minimum wage, civil rights, and immigration reform. Joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Fred Harris is a professor of political science at the University of New Mexico. He is, of course, well remembered among Democrats and others as a senator from his native Oklahoma from 1964 to 1973, and also as a candidate for the party's nomination for president in 1976. Senator Harris was outspoken in opposition to the Vietnam War and in defense of Native American rights, and continues to be a leader in promoting progressive causes. Senator Harris, thank you very much, as always, for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Good to be back with you, particularly as we've launched upon a second progressive term.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, and always nice to speak with you. So, with a re-elected Barack Obama, where does the nation go from here, economically and politically?
Well, I think actually the campaigns pointed it out pretty well, pointed which way we're headed. The Obama administration, or Obama campaign from the very first, intended to make this a choice election, choose between Obama and his views and those of Romney and of his party, and I think that's what the choice. I think that was what the election turned on. So I think we're going to see the ending of the Afghan war. We're going to see the full implementation and maybe improvement of the Affordable Care Act. We're going to see these regulations enforced on Wall Street and the big banks. I think we'll firm up Social Security's financial status with raising the cap on income that's subject to the tax. We're going to let the income tax cut of the Bush administration expire in regard to people making more than $250,000 a year. A lot more investment in education and training, in the alternative energy sources, strict enforcement of the higher standards for gasoline consumption in automobiles, Planned Parenthood funded and supported. We're going to see progressive appointees to the Supreme Court, I think, in this 4 years, maybe a couple, and we're going to see immigrant rights respected and a reform of immigration laws. That's a sort of a quick rundown of the kind of things that Obama has pledged to do, and they were very different from what we could have expected from a President Romney.
Obviously, there was a great deal of opposition throughout the president's first 4 years. Is it easier this time around for him? Does he have a leg up? And can he get more of some of these things pushed through more easily this time around? Because as a lot of people say, this is a mandate of the people.
It is a mandate, and I think that if we can harken back to it, an interview I saw of Bill Clinton, who's about as smart on politics and government as anybody we know. He, in an interview with Piers Morgan, Piers Morgan asked him, now you, Morgan said, in effect, you got along with the Republicans and were able to reach agreements with them and so forth in the Congress, and former President Clinton said, no, that's not true. During my first term, they tried to block everything. I couldn't get a single vote for my first budget, for example, from the Republicans. But he said, when they shut the government down, or were the cause of it, the people turned against them, and that really sort of broke the fever. And after that, they became much more tractable and much more willing to make deals. And he said President Obama did not have such an event during his first 4 years, but his reelection will be that kind of an event. He said when he gets reelected, as I think he will get reelected, that will strengthen Boehner's hand against the extremists, the Tea Party crowd that have taken over his caucus in the House. And he thinks, Clinton went on to say, that he thought that we would be able to kind of make the government operate a little better without all this gridlock we've had in the past. I think there's something to that, and that's my hope.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Let's talk about some surprises, if any. What surprised you most about the outcome of the election, whether it's House, Senate, state returns?
Well, I was so impressed, starting with the Democratic Convention in Charlotte, with how openly progressive on all issues, including the social issues, you might call them, that the Democratic Party has become. For example, just take social issues. I don't believe there was a single speaker at the Democratic Convention this past convention who didn't mention Roe versus Wade or woman's right to choose, for sure, and the right of people to marry whomever they wanted to, same-sex marriage. And every time those issues were mentioned in the Democratic Convention, it caused an enormous a roar of approval and applause. And the same was true, for example, when the President and others, for example, Elizabeth Warren made a great populist speech against concentrated corporate and economic power, and all of that I thought was a somewhat of a change. A lot of those issues in the past we believed in and had in our platform always, but we were not always that openly enthusiastic about expressing those views. That's changed, and I think that gave the people a really clear choice. Although, of course, toward the end, Romney began to see he couldn't get elected by saying what he had been saying and what the extremists had pushed him to say, and he began to sort of look like or act like he was moving more toward the left. But I think that people saw through that.
Mm-hmm. How do you assess the Senate election in New Mexico, and what does it hold for the future of state politics?
Well, we again, I think you have to mention Hispanics. In the last decade, New Mexico has gained 13% in population, but 70% of that gain has come from Hispanics. And that has made our state, we've always been a fairly progressive state and mostly Democratic, but that's even more true than it was before. So, for example, the district from which Martin Heinrich had been elected to Congress, he's the new senator now from the whole state, but his district, which is centered in Albuquerque, Bernalillo County, that used to be a kind of a toss-up district, and it always, until he was elected, been held by a Republican. But now I think it's become a blue district. I think it's a reliably Democratic district. And, for example, the people just overwhelmingly adopted a referendum in the same vote as when Martin Heinrich was elected to the Senate, an increase in the minimum wage coupled with an accelerator clause so that the minimum wage will now go up together with the cost of living. And that is a big change, I think, in that district and to some degree in that state. I mean, in the whole state. So things are looking up here, I think, as they are in so many states, although we've got our work cut out for us in a lot of remaining states as well.
We're speaking with Fred Harris, professor of political science at the University of New Mexico, of course, former Democratic senator from his native Oklahoma from 1964 to 1973. Since you entered politics, the civil rights of so many Americans have been expanded. African Americans, women, gays, Latino, Native Americans. What progress still needs to be made, or have we moved past civil rights into a movement for economic rights?
No, I don't think we can ever relax in regard to civil rights. John Lewis, who is, I think, a kind of living saint, has made that quite clear, and I agree with him. We have to be forever vigilant and aggressive in regard to human rights and civil rights. But also, we've got to expand sort of our idea about that to include, for example, immigrant rights. We've got all these people, they say as many as 11 million people living here in the shadows, often exploited, and they, I think, represent sort of the civil rights cause of our day, and we've got to regularize their legal residence and a citizenship path for them, and I hope that we're going to do that now with the re-election of President Obama with 70% vote from the Hispanic population in the country. There's some other things we need to do in regard to economic rights. I think it's highly important that we raise the minimum wage and couple it with the sort of automatic increases in the future based on the increase in the rate of inflation, or the cost of living, I should say. And that I can't think of anything that would stimulate the economy as rapidly and be of such great benefit to so many people, raising the minimum wage. The other thing is sort of related to that, and that is the rights of organized labor. We've got to knock down these barriers to unions being able to organize plants and companies and make it far easier. That's, I think, essential for progressive politics, and it's also essential for trying to rebuild a middle class. I don't think you can have a really stable democracy. I don't think you can really have a healthy and growing economy unless we have a healthy and growing and stable middle class. And a big key to that, I think, is making it easier for people to organize into unions.
Now, before we let you go, you are a professor at the University of New Mexico. What national or global issues do your students seem to be most interested in?
Well, they're modern in their outlook. And I say it this way. For example, 4 years ago, when in the Democratic Party we had as our two principal candidates a woman, Hillary Clinton, and an African American, Barack Obama. And when you talk to students, they saw nothing odd or unusual about that. That just seemed okay. And they're the same way about such issues as same-sex marriage. What's all the fuss about? How is that a threat to traditional marriage and so forth? They're much more modern, and I think that's why they were so attracted to Obama 4 years ago, and why they were again this time. There are a lot of people saying, well, the youth this year, this election, are just not going to be as involved and so forth. Turns out their percentage of the total vote this time was a little bit increased. They're 19% of the electorate in the recent election, and they voted very strongly for Barack Obama. The majority of them did. So the rights of women, for example, they just take that as a given, and they can't imagine that women wouldn't receive the same pay, for example, for doing the same work that a man does. I think that I've seen a change. For example, there were a lot of young people who were very much attracted to Ronald Reagan, a more charismatic person than they'd seen, I think, or maybe that's who they grew up with. And but that's changed since then, and I think they're much more moved by these kinds of issues, modern issues, than was true for a long time.
Well, they've got a good teacher. Fred Harris is a professor of political science at the University of New Mexico, of course remembered as a senator from his native Oklahoma from 1964, 1973, and as a candidate for the party's nomination for president in 1976. Senator Harris, thank you, as always, for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Take care. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Larry Gibson is a prominent attorney and law professor in Baltimore. He has a new book out called Young Thurgood, which delves into the early years of Thurgood Marshall, the nation's first African-American Supreme Court justice. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Larry Gibson is a law professor at the University of Maryland, a prominent attorney in Baltimore, and former Justice Department official in the Carter administration. His new biography of the first African-American Supreme Court justice, Young Thurgood, is the first one to win the approval of Thurgood Marshall's immediate family. Professor Larry Gibson, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
And thank you for having me.
Now, most of what historians know about Thurgood Marshall is about his career as a civil rights advocate, his work with the NAACP, his service as a federal appeals judge and Supreme Court justice. But that's not what your book is about, is it?
No, it's not. This book is not a book principally about what Thurgood Marshall did. It only carries him up to the age 30. This, instead, is a book about what Thurgood Marshall was like and the forces that shaped him.
Now, tell us about some of the contrasts in Marshall's personality that allowed him to be so passionate yet so successful at working with opponents.
Marshall was shaped by environment, by people, and by events. Now, the environment was the state of Maryland. As the state of Maryland has historically had this sort of split personality. It's often called the most southern northern state and the most northern southern state. And at the time, for example, of the Civil War, half of the African Americans in the state of Maryland were slaves and half of them were freemen. Well, that kind of dual, almost schizophrenic personality of a state continued for many years and affected Marshall. So he therefore grew up in an environment that had many of the ills of the segregation and other discriminations against blacks of the Deep South, but also a place in which he found that there were lots of decent people, decent white people, black people, judges who really were willing to enforce the law. And Thurgood Marshall decided to work in that environment and to begin bringing about changes, some of which were first steps that then were later taken nationally.
So he had a sense of hope in the state of Maryland, given those demographics.
That is correct. I mean, that's why this is a state in which the first case that's called the first step on the road to Brown versus Board of Education was brought by Thurgood Marshall in 1935. The suit that desegregated the University of Maryland School of Law. It was the first time any judge in the United States ordered the desegregation of an educational facility. And, of course, that ultimately led to the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision.
We're speaking with Larry Gibson, law professor at the University of Maryland, biographer, his biography, Young Thurgood, which was the first to win approval of Thurgood Marshall's immediate family. What were some of the key events or milestones in Thurgood Marshall's early life that led to his later achievements?
Well, first of all, I point out in the book that Thurgood Marshall became an advocate before he knew or decided what he would be an advocate for. Early in his life, what he studied, I think fairly aggressively, the art of verbal advocacy. In this book, I set forth for the reader his entire academic record. You actually see images of his transcripts from high school through college, through a law school. And one will see in those that Thurgood Marshall studied public speaking and rhetoric and logic, Latin, Greek, German. Before he even went to law school, he had engaged for 8 years as a competitive debater, starting in the 9th grade of high school through college. He participated when he was at Lincoln University as an undergraduate student in the first interracial debate in the United States. He debated as a student at Lincoln, but he debated at Harvard University. So this is a man who was fascinated with becoming a strong advocate. Then in law school, in his last year of law school, he came under the influence of the law school dean, Charles Hamilton Houston. And so I think just the beginning of their relationship was an important event. But even that may not have led to much, but for the fact that 1 week after Thurgood Marshall became a lawyer, there occurred in Maryland the last lynching, a horrific lynching of a man on the Eastern Shore. Houston was very upset by it, and he got Marshall involved in the anti-lynching movement. And I've often wondered if that had not occurred, sort of whether they would have reconnected. So that Armwood lynching, which is the subject of the first chapter of the book, is another significant event, and that's part of what I try to do in this book, which is to tell about not only the circumstances of Maryland, but also some of the key events that shaped this man.
Now, my understanding, Thurgood Marshall actually was expelled from his college fraternity at one point. Tell us about that incident.
Well, first of all, that did not occur, and a part of what I wanted to do with this book was to get rid of some of the folklore around Thurgood Marshall that's not true. Some of it, I must say, he encouraged. I have a whole chapter dealing with his college career. There was really only one disciplinary matter in his 4 and a half years there. And it was a time when he and 21 other sophomores were suspended briefly for hazing freshmen. Actually, Thurgood had a pretty minor role in the whole matter and received about the lowest penalty. He was suspended for a couple of weeks, other students for longer periods of time, and he was just in a room when they were continuing a Lincoln University tradition of cutting the hair of freshmen. That is the totality of his difficulties from a disciplinary matter. But I know the source of this inaccuracy about this is being expelled, but it's just simply not true.
Well, it's nice that you can also dispel some myths and non-truths here too. Now, briefly, if you would, tell us about Marshall's role in the historic Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. Did you discover anything new about that case in your research?
Well, of course, this book only covers Thurgood Marshall up to the age 30, but I think that what is important is that my book covers are his first early cases that sort of led to Brown. The first case that was successful was the University of Maryland School of Law case, but the next case was his first major loss. It involved Baltimore County, the county surrounding Baltimore City. It had 10 high schools, but African Americans could not attend any of them, and Marshall brought a lawsuit attempting to get blacks admitted to the county high schools, and he lost that lawsuit. So those are the beginning of the sequence of cases that led to Brown. Of course, the 54 decision involved a combination of 5 separate lawsuits in different states, and Thurgood Marshall was the sort of quarterback of all of the litigation. He specifically argued the case from South Carolina, a case called Briggs. But this was the end of a long process that really began in the period covered by my book, Young Thurgood.
Now, before we let you go, Professor, what effect did Thurgood Marshall have on you personally, both in your decision to study law and then as his biographer?
The first part of the book, actually the preface, I described the first time I met Thurgood Marshall, which was July the 1st, 1975. I was already a young lawyer. I went to his house late to have him sign an emergency order. He spent about 10 or 15 minutes discussing the legal matters, but then I didn't get out of his house for another 2 hours as he regaled me and another young lawyer with one story after the other about his time and his youth here in Baltimore. And it's when I began to get a perspective of him that was inconsistent with what I was mainly reading from other writers. He had this unbelievable, very sense of humor. He had a much more positive attitude towards Baltimore and Maryland than I had been led to believe by other writings. And so that's when I got particularly interested in examining his life and what he was like. Of course, it's natural that even before that, as a black lawyer from Baltimore City, I would have had a special interest in this black lawyer from Baltimore City who had reached the Supreme Court. But it is that encounter in 1975 when my interest in Thurgood Marshall got really piqued and I began to assemble information. Now, I didn't decide to actually write a book about him until much later. That was in 2002. So this book has been 10 years in the actual writing of the book, although my research about Thurgood Marshall began in 1975.
Larry Gibson is a law professor at the University of Maryland. His new biography, Young Thurgood, which is about, of course, the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall. Professor Gibson, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. We hope to talk to you again soon.
I certainly would enjoy that.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his Common Sense Commentary.
Get ready, America, for here comes the next latest and greatest thing in aviation. Wow, what could it be? Maybe the airlines are going to drop all of their ridiculous rip-off fees. That'd be great. No, not that kind of aviation. Also, you probably won't find this breakthrough so great. It's the arrival and proliferation of, quote, unmanned vehicle systems, soon to be buzzing around in the airspace of your own town. Yes, drones, right here at home. Those very same tiny, pilotless, remote-controlled, undetectable planes that the CIA has been secretly using to spy on and bomb people in Pakistan and elsewhere are headed to your and my local police departments, FBI offices, and, well, who knows who else will have these latest and greatest toys. All we know is that Congress, under pressure from Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and other big drone peddlers, directed the Federal Aviation Agency earlier this year to open up civilian airspace to thousands of them by 2015. And in their wisdom, our loosey-goosey lawmakers provided no regulation of who can have drones, how many, or for what purpose. So prepare to be pestered and monitored, for police agencies and corporate interests are said to be abuzz about getting their own. The first ones are expected to be used for high-altitude surveillance, which is worrisome enough, but a Texas sheriff's office that already has bought a Shadowhawk drone says it might outfit the little buzzer to fire tear gas and rubber bullets. No worries, though, for the drone industry's lobbying group has drafted a 2-page code of conduct, urging purchasers to, quote, respect the privacy of individuals. This is Jim Hightower saying, but it's a voluntary code and totally unenforceable. For more information, contact the Electronic Privacy Information Center, epic.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Steve Conn is a historian and author of a book examining the benefits of government. He talks with us today about the fetish Republicans have about states' rights, the rallying cry for slavery, attacking reproductive freedom, and suppressing voting rights. Professor Conn says Republicans are laissez-faire when it suits them, but in favor of government help when they need it. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Steve Conn is professor and director of public history at Ohio State University. He is the founding editor of the online magazine Origins, Current Events in Historical Perspective, and editor of an important new book called To Promote General Welfare, The Case for Big Government. Steve Conn, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, tell us about why you decided to put together a collection of essays promoting big government. I mean, didn't it have something to do with a family camping trip?
You know, it did actually. Back in the summer of 2010, I was out in the Four Corners region of the Southwest with my wife and kids, and we were having a great time, and we were going from, visiting these incredible national parks, and we were riding on these unbelievable interstate highways that get you through that landscape. We were going past these immense irrigation projects, reservoirs, and as we were driving around that part of the country, we kept passing all of these really angry billboards denouncing the federal government. And we sort of laughed at all of this because, of course, everything out there was made possible by the federal government, and all of these people's livelihoods depended on programs of one sort and another from the federal government, but they didn't seem to get it. And then I think it might have been in the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, I had this idea that maybe what we ought to do is put together a collection of short, readable, breezy essays from some of America's leading historians that puts the role of the federal government in our lives in some long historical perspective. And so putting out a campfire one night, my wife and I started talking about this, and I had the idea for this book, and I hope that what this book will do really is to give us some deeper and more meaningful context to have this discussion about what the role of the federal government ought to be.
You state that the belief in a free market that can solve any problem is fiction because there really isn't any market that is truly free. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think what we're suffering from right now, and really maybe for the better part of the last generation, is something I've called free market fundamentalism, that the free market is the solution to all of our problems, and really everything we have in society just ought to be privatized or turned over to the private sector one way or another. And we've seen a lot of that over the last 20, 30 years. The problem, of course, is twofold. First of all, there really isn't a genuinely free market, and there really never has been, except in the seminar rooms of economics departments, because the market itself is created by a whole set of social, political, and legal structures. The very basis upon which a market economy works, for example, is the contract. That's the fundamental instrument of any kind of private sector economy. Well, who sets the terms of those contracts? Who provides the mechanisms of enforcement? That's, of course, a political question. And so really what we have is markets shaped by political and social forces. And once we acknowledge that the free market doesn't exist like some galaxy out there in nature, what we have to understand is that we all have a role to play in debating exactly how that market is going to be shaped, for whose advantage, and who's going to suffer as a consequence. That's really the political conversation we ought to have. Now, the second part of the problem with free market fundamentalism, of course, is that the free market does some things really well. The private sector does all kinds of things that we would never want to give up. It doesn't do other things. And to pretend, therefore, that we should simply turn all aspects of our social lives and our economy and society over to the private sector really is simply, as I said, it's a kind of fundamentalist faith. It's not a pragmatic way to solve problems. The private sector will give you terrific prices on consumer electronics or build cars and things like that, but it won't build sewer systems or water treatment plants or educate your kids very well. So we need to recognize what the private sector ought to be doing and what it ought to be good at, and what the public sector needs to take responsibility for, and we ought to fund that appropriately.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're speaking with Steve Conn, professor, director of public history at Ohio State University, also the editor of this new book called To Promote General Welfare, The Case for Big Government. Even the most laissez-faire capitalists turn to the government when it suits their interests.
Yep.
Can you give some of the more egregious examples of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor?
Sure. Yeah, that's right. This myth that once upon a time we had this economy that was run by great swashbuckling laissez-faire capitalists is really just a myth. And let me take you all the way back to 1789. The first act that the first Congress of the United States ever passed was a bill to enable the United States to exist. The second piece of legislation it passed was a bill to support domestic manufacturing. So from the very beginning, the first president of the United States, the first Congress of the United States intervened on behalf of domestic manufacturers, as they were called at the time. Across the 19th century, the government helped out big business in all kinds of ways. The Trans-Mississippi Railroad system that got built, those great transcontinental railroad lines, were all built because the federal government subsidized those railroad companies in the form of free land. The federal government simply gave away land to railroad corporations, which they could then turn around and sell to raise the capital in order to build those transcontinental railroad lines. So we would never have had those railroads had the federal government not stepped in. In the last quarter of the 19th century, particularly, even into the early 20th century, big industrialists demanding a laissez-faire economy, every time their workers went out on strike, they called out the federal troops, so that the federal government intervened on a number of occasions, and very infamously in places like Pullman in the 1890s, against striking workers. So laissez-faire when it suited them, government intervention when they needed it. That's really the bargain that got set by the late 19th century. And I could rattle off a dozen other examples, but I think that gives you a flavor of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. You know, you also talk about the fetish of states' rights. Do you think, as many do, that states' rights was really a cloak by which to justify slavery and since then a way of keeping control over minorities, women, immigrants?
Yeah, let me be honest about this as a historian. That phrase, the fetish of states' rights, which I quite like, it was actually coined by the great American historian Arthur Schlesinger Sr., not Jr., but his father, back in the 1920s, when he recognized that this call for states' rights was usually not so much a principled defense of a set of policies, but really a situational way for states to do what they wanted when the federal government was telling them otherwise. We've seen states' rights used as a rallying cry, I think, several times in American history. First, in the 1850s, by Southern states to defend slavery. Then in the 1950s, by Southern states to defend segregation. More recently, we have seen it used first as a way of trying to attack the reproductive freedom that women have. This really began with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. More recently still, states have been at the forefront of trying to ban gay marriage, and many states have done that. The state of Ohio, where I am right now, passed a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage. And in the election cycle of 2012, where we see states' rights playing out most egregiously, is in the voter suppression efforts on the part of the Republican Party. And that effort, we see it in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Texas, Florida, a number of places. It really ought to give us some pause, ask the question, why should your basic right of citizenship as a citizen of the United States, the right to vote, be different depending on which state you live in? That strikes me as an absurdity, and clearly the Republican Party in 2012 is using these states' rights rallying cry as a way of trying to take the vote away from certain constituencies of people. So, yeah, I do believe that states' rights is usually a screen for things that really are un-American.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it also kind of covers things up too, right? I mean,
that's right. You can claim a high-minded constitutional principle while you are taking away people's right to vote, which is really what we're seeing in the election cycle of 2012.
Ignore the man behind the big curtain, right?
That's correct. That's right. That's right.
We're speaking to Stephen Conn, professor, director of public history at Ohio State University, editor of the book To Promote General Welfare, The Case for Big Government. One of the chapters in your books is titled From Franklin to Facebook. What's the connection between the two?
Yeah, well, Franklin, of course, was the man even before there was a United States who really reorganized the postal system, the mail, and he did so brilliantly. He did so very successfully, and that reorganization became the basis upon which the United States established its first national communication system, the mail. And that was done through the Postal Act of 1792, one of those really critical pieces of legislation. Fast forward to the most recent innovation in communication, and of course the federal government was central. I'm sorry to report this to certain people, but yes, the federal government really was central to building the architecture of the Internet. It came out of the Defense Department. It came with public money. It was public spending. It was those research efforts and then engineering efforts going back into the 1960s which created the Internet that we all take advantage of today. There are two aspects to that, I think, that are significant. The first is, of course, economically, the communication infrastructure of the United States, which the federal government was central in building, is absolutely vital to the growth of the economy from the late 18th century through to the beginning of the 21st century. So economically, this was a tremendously good investment that the federal government made. But just as importantly, that First Amendment right we all have to freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and so on, is in a sense made it's made actionable because of this communication infrastructure. It doesn't really much matter if I have a right to free speech if nobody can hear me. But through the mails and through the press and through now the Internet, our voices can be heard. So that communication infrastructure makes the First Amendment possible. It makes it real. And so for both those reasons, for both the constitutional reason and for the economic reason, building that communication infrastructure has been just a tremendously good thing for the country.
Before we let you go, do you think Democrats ought to be making an argument for big government, or should they instead try to minimize their differences with Republicans on the issue?
I don't think that, the title of that book is in some ways a little tongue-in-cheek. It's not that we need big government or we need small government. We need government to do the things we want to do. And so the case that Democrats, I think, ought to be making is a case for collective purpose, for shared destiny. The Republican Party really has become the party of me, mine, more. And the Democratic Party ought to stand for us and ours and together. And when we stand for those kinds of principles, that kind of agenda, what we recognize is that the federal government is simply an effective tool for accomplishing some of those goals. That's, I think, the case we need to make. It's us. It's not just me.
Good stuff. Professor Conn, Director of Public History at Ohio State University. The book is To Promote General Welfare, The Case for Big Government. You pick it up and it would make a great gift as we head into the holiday season, correct?
That's right. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you for joining us today, Professor. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Fred Harris, Larry Gibson, and Steve Conn. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to America's